Tēnā koutou, nau mai, haere mai. Hello everyone, welcome to the Walking the Shadowlands podcast. Let me be your guide as we take a walk into the realms of the unexplained, of the paranormal, of things that go bump in the night and haunt your dreams.
Your hosts?
I'm Marianne. Thanks so much for joining me today, tonight, whatever time it is, wherever you're living in this beautiful world of ours. Sit back, relax. Let me be your guide as we walk into the Shadowlands together and see what awaits us there. Kia ora, welcome everyone. If you're returning, thanks heaps for coming back to listen to another episode. If you are a new listener, thank you so much for joining us all today. It's great to have you all here with us. Strange Encounters Down Under. That's not as naughty as the title might suggest. In this episode, we're hopping across the ditch, as we say here in New Zealand, to visit with our Aussie, as us Kiwis call them, or our Australian neighbours. We're going to look at a few Aussie myths and legends and talk a wee bit about that with my guest, and then the rest of this episode is going to be focused on my guest's 30-odd years working in the paranormal and, in particular, UFO-related fields of study. Are you willing to walk with us into this part of the Shadowlands and see where this journey will take us? Then let's begin. Sheryl's had a lifelong interest in the paranormal and began actively studying the paranormal in 1980 with her interest in near-death experiences. Soon after, she joined the International Association for Near-Death Studies and in 1995 hosted Dr. Ken Ring on tour in Australia, presenting research for his future book, Mind Sight, Near-Death and Out-of-Body Experiences in the Blind. In 1988, Sheryl's other interest in extraterrestrial life led her to join the Brisbane-based association UFO Research Queensland, and in 1992, Sheryl, with her late husband, Dr. Martin Gottschall, established the first close encounter support group in Brisbane. Sheryl's current research bridges the afterlife and UFO subjects, and in 2012, she established the monthly Afterlife Discussions Group. She continues to find links between close encounters with non-human intelligences and the afterlife, and believes that the two great mysteries of our time, are we alone in the universe and what happens when we die, may be more deeply connected than we realize. Sheryl has had many paranormal experiences herself, including an NDE, out-of-body experience, UFO sightings, and a close encounter with non-human intelligences, poltergeist activity, automatic writing, and other unexplained phenomena, all of which propel her to continue her quest to understand what it means to be human. She speaks regularly about the UFO phenomenon and the afterlife at public meetings, conferences, community groups, schools and library groups, and has given hundreds of media interviews. She writes for UFO and New Age magazines and worked as a clinical hypnotherapist. She was a regular guest on the weekly Spooky Action radio show in 2018 and co-hosted the Strange Encounters radio show in 2019 to 2020. She's currently the host of the YouTube Strange Encounters Down Under podcast. My guest, Sheryl Gottschall. I'd like to welcome my guest, Sheryl Gottschall. It's really great to have you here with us today. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what got you interested in this whole general field.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Marianne. I'm delighted to talk to people about these subjects, living it, breathing it, thinking it, like many people who do podcasts and, researchers, investigators, people of interest, yeah. I think I always had a tendency to be interested in things outside of the normal because when I was a kid, I used to sit outside and look out at the stars and wonder if there was life out there. And I used to think, I wonder if there are people out there on planets looking at Earth thinking, I wonder if there's life on there, So that's quite common. I found that myself because I interview people too. And that's a very common trait for people to have to do that when they're children, which I had no clue until I started talking to people. When I was old enough to start earning my own income, I'd buy a magazine here in Australia which was called Australasian Post, which is defunct now.
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah, and it was a great magazine. I think John Pinkney used to write a lot in there, and he's passed away now, but he's a well-known author of books on the paranormal. I used to read articles, and I was just, amazed at people's stories, and it used to ignite my interest, even more. But then that sort of died down as you grow up and you go to work and buy a house and have family and all that. But in 1975, I got interested in, or around that time, between 75 and 80, I got interested in the afterlife. And it was about 75, I think, that Raymond Moody coined the term near-death experiences. And I was fascinated by those stories. Right. So I started looking into that. And then there were three people. I know Dr. Ken Ring was one of the co-founders of IANS, the International Association of Near-Death Studies. So I became a member of that. Mm. And little did I know at the time, later on in the 90s, I'd be hosting Ken as he was doing his Australian book tour. I used to get the old audio tapes of conferences sent out to Australia from the IANS conferences. And from there, I sort of developed an interest in God. Basically, everyone at some stage seems, ask, is this all there is? What else? What is my purpose? And all those sorts of things. Mm. So I did a home Bible study course, and that led me to, after 3 years, coming to the point that I think these descriptions of angelic visitations are more like close encounter experiences. And then from there, I've been in UFO research now for 33 years. And since 2012, I've been running a monthly afterlife discussions group as well. So, yeah, and now I'm doing a podcast called Strange Encounters Down Under, which people can find on YouTube. But we talk about all sorts of things that you do too, Marianne. And I'm so pleased to connect with you, with a like-minded person.
Isn't it great?
Yes.
I've interviewed a number of people who have, like yourself, an interest in this area. I interviewed a wonderful gentleman in Australia. Can't think of his name offhand, but he studied the Yowie for years and years, and we had a great conversation. I've had people that have studied other cryptids, people in the States with Bigfoot. It's a really, really interesting subject. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that aspect at the moment, and you could perhaps tell me some of the favourite stories that you've heard in your journey in this part of the Shadowlands.
Yeah, sure, about the cryptids. Wow. I've a colleague here who was just speaking recently about this, about he had an experience some years ago where he was outside near his swimming pool and in the evening at a place called Grafton in New South Wales in Australia. And he saw this living creature, which was shaped like a boomerang, but it was covered in scales, and it was flying towards him, I think he said it was something like, about 1.5 to 2 meters across. It was huge. It was just, I've never heard a story like that here in Australia, ever. So that was really unusual. I haven't actually seen a Yowie myself, and frankly, I don't think I want to. I don't want to get that close.
Yeah, so they sound a little bit scary, to
Yeah,
be
and
honest.
I don't know whether you're talking about Dean Harrison or Ray Doherty here in Australia, who are very interested in yowies, but I've heard some of their reports and about yowies, particularly around Brisbane. Ray has been looking at those, and during COVID, when people weren't going out so much, reports were coming in closer to the city. I think he said one was actually about 16 kilometres southwest of Brisbane.
Oh, interesting.
They're coming in quite close, but
Wow.
my understanding is that, the ones that are sort of live on the periphery of civilization are a little bit more used to human beings. But as you go further into the bushland, that they can be quite aggressive because they're not used to humans, So
Mm.
there are cases here. We've had black panthers in Queensland, and that's quite historical in going back. Oh gosh, tens and tens and tens of decades here in Australia. But in Queensland, there was one seen recently up around Cardwell in North Queensland.
Right.
And I have wondered, I have gone back and looked through Trove, which is where the National Archives are putting a lot of the old newspaper clippings. And there have been reports of circuses that were in Australia around the early 1900s where the owners just left and let the animals go. So I have wondered whether the Black Panthers had something to do with that. I'm not really sure.
Right.
But it is unusual that they're actually often seen as a singular animal, which is really, really strange. So, yeah, we certainly have our fair share of cryptid reports here in Australia.
We've had Black Panther reports here in New Zealand as well, mainly down in the Canterbury region, which is in the South Island. But, it does make you wonder because these reports are consistent in countries that don't have Indigenous big cats.
And obviously, wherever they came from, they've adapted to the environment, so that's interesting. But we have all sorts of strange creatures here. I mean, I just think historically, when people came out to Australia, for example, they saw the platypus, and originally they thought it was a hoax and joke when they sent one back to England. So. But, to them, a platypus might have seemed like a cryptid, or the Tasmanian tiger might have seemed like, was it, a cryptid? Looking at it, it depends on how you look at these, creatures, the times you live in and what's culturally and scientifically accepted, doesn't it?
It is, absolutely, that's true. I know here in New Zealand, I did an episode in my first season. I did a whole pile of New Zealand-based episodes, and one was on the cryptids in New Zealand. And when we say cryptids, we're talking about cryptozoological animals that may perhaps not have been properly identified, not necessarily animals that are legendary or mythical. Like we had a type of otter, and I can't remember the Maori name offhand. It's no longer around, it's extinct. But it was for that period of time, and it was sighted quite regularly when New Zealand was being colonised.
Yeah, and I think you're right there. I think some of them were never identified, and over time they've probably died off and become quite rare as well. Yeah.
Do you know many of the Aboriginal legends of cryptids, like the bunyip and the...
Yeah, I'm aware of them. Yes, the bunyip is an interesting one. They, living in waterholes, and they were used, stories about them were used to scare the children to make sure they did the right thing and didn't go out at night and all those sorts of but there have been reports of them. Again, when I've gone back through Trove and looked at the old newspaper articles, there were certainly reports in Brisbane, actually, and just east of Brisbane along the coast in an area we call the Redlands. And bunyips were reported to be seen there. Now, whether that was accurate or not, or whether it was, because they were reported by European settlers, right, not Aboriginal people, but I just wonder whether the Aboriginal mythology had come into their thinking, and maybe they misidentified something, or maybe it actually was a bunyip that is now extinct or very rare, very rarely seen. Yeah.
For those listeners who aren't from Australia or New Zealand and haven't heard of a bunyip, can you please explain what a bunyip is supposed to be?
Well, actually, I can talk about one report that I dug out of the newspaper archives. And, of course, Australians, when they hear of bunyips, they actually think of them as some sort of a legend. But one of the reports was back in 1850. It appeared in the Moreton Bay Courier, and it was an aquatic monster seen off the property of a person in Logan River in Queensland, which is my state. And a female member of a Mr. Pryor, female member of his family, was walking near a large lagoon at the station that they were living on when she saw on the surface of the water a living animal of extraordinary shape and dimensions. And she described it as the head appearing to be elongated and flattened like the bill of a platypus, the body from the place where it joined the head to about 5 feet backwards seemed like that of a gigantic eel, being about the ordinary thickness of a man's body. So we're not talking about something really tiny. We're talking about some really solid sort of, creature. But she said it was much larger because its head was coiled. It had a coiled body. And beyond those coils was what seemed to be the tail of a fish and having the semi-transparent appearance of a bladder.
Right.
The head was small and narrow in proportion to the size of the body, and it was furnished with what seemed to be 2 horns, which were quite white. So it's a real mix.
Yeah, it's a real mix.
That was their description, yeah.
First it sounded to me like you were describing, is it a plesiosaurus?
I think that's it.
When I did the New Zealand ones, we have our taniwha here, which is kind of a creature who lives in the waters, but not only in the waters, on the land as well. And in the 1800s, there were a number of sightings,
yeah.
One of the opinions put forward was that it was the plesiosaurus.
I don't know how they go from lagoon to lagoon because some lagoons actually dry out in summer here. Often they.
Yeah, right.
So where do they exist and how do they exist? So, unless they've adapted to the environment, to that situation. But it's a very short time for adaptation to take place, though, like 150, 200 years.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, and of course, your waterholes do dry up. That's an Australian thing, isn't it? Yeah, very interesting. And I remember reading about, when I was doing research for my interview with that chap in Aussie, an Aboriginal legend about this creature that would take, and I don't know if it was one of these cautionary tales that parents told their kids, but an Aboriginal creature that would actually take children if they went away from the parents.
Yes, I know what you're talking about.
Don't know what its name was.
Was it the hairy man, the short hairy man?
That was one of the ideas of what it was, but another one was a shadowy type figure. I just find these myths and legends so fascinating because they all come from somewhere, and they're not all stories. Very often, as you say, it's maybe it's the only way a person can describe it, has the ability to describe what they saw, but it doesn't mean that it isn't a living being of some description.
Yeah. Unlike the Wandjina, who are spirit beings,
That's it.
Was it?
Wandjina, that's it. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, so they're spirit beings, from my understanding anyway. And anyone who is an Australian Aboriginal Indigenous person who's listening to this, I'm obviously acknowledging that I have no clue about your own understanding and that you understand your own culture far better than I ever could.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so Wandjina are spirit beings, and yes, they were used to have been used to threaten children, to not stray away from them. Yeah, definitely.
The reason I bring that up is that I came across a story in my research of a fairly recent case of a sighting. And it was some teenagers, I think, or a teenager or something like this. I can't even remember. I wish I could remember it, but I remember thinking, oh, that's interesting, and that's fairly recent. I think it might have been in the 90s.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I actually think I have that newspaper clipping that I put on our Strange Encounters Facebook page. But my interest in the Wandjina, I mean, when you see the paintings, and while our Indigenous people, portray them as spirit beings, I have wondered sometimes whether they were actually, in times gone by, whether they could have originally been extraterrestrial beings.
My thought as well.
Yes, and I do think that some extraterrestrials can actually be. I mean, I don't know why I think this exactly, but that they actually have the ability to be physical and non-physical.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I don't think that that's too big a stretch of the imagination, because let's face it, we're still discovering life on Earth. We have no idea of how life has evolved in the universe. So, and I do know that there's a book called The Book of Urantia. And
yes,
so in there they talk about the midwayers, and the midwayers are the beings who are not of Earth, and they have the ability to be physical and both non-physical.
Right.
And actually, years ago, we had a guest speaker who had been to, I think it was the Farsight Institute, and had been doing remote viewing there.
I've heard of that.
They had been asked to remote view life on Mars, and that's why I'd asked him to come along to be a guest speaker to talk about what they'd found. But
right.
He said that one of the exercises they did was to remote view God. Well, no one got any, they got nothing for that. But then they were asked to remote view the afterlife. And when they did that, they came across these beings called the midwayers, which led him to, the Book of Urantia. And I actually had a copy anyway, which is toad of a book. And I find that fascinating, because it's all about the different beings and the different levels of life that populate the universe, basically. These midwayers are charged with the role of helping people after they've died to take where they need to go. A bit like, spirit helpers after we die. These have the ability to be physical as well. And I have wondered, were they extraterrestrials, who had decided to take on this role, or perhaps were doing that role before humans were even on Earth anyway? So there's a lot to think about in that.
Right. Yes, an awful lot. And I've always said to people who, because I'm not religious at all, but for people who are religious, and like my sister, for example, she's been a minister, her and her husband have been a minister for decades. And when they talk about angels, I say to them, well, Lynn, think about it. What are angels but extraterrestrial beings?
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, if you really will it down, Jesus was an alien hybrid.
I had a really interesting chat that one of my favourite guests, and you may have heard of him, he wrote a book called Escaping from Eden.
Was that Paul Wallace?
Yes, Paul Wallace, that's the one. Really fascinating. I've had him on twice. Such a lovely chap to talk to. And he was a minister for like 40 years, and he had an accident and he was recovering. So he spent some time going over Genesis, because he had always had questions about Genesis, like, let us go down and make man in our image. And he couldn't reconcile how there could only be one God and all these gods. And so in his studies, he came to the conclusion, through studying ancient texts, including the one you mentioned, and other ancient literature from around the world, that humanity was created by a race of extraterrestrial beings who in fact were warring amongst themselves over humanity.
And I that really leads me into the idea of the jinn. Islamic jinn, because they also sort of have been warring over humanity too, in a more of a retaliatory way. So
yes,
and I have wondered how they tie in with the alien abduction experiences, because for those people who don't know about the jinn, these are beings that can attach themselves to family lines, and they can be benefic or they can be malevolent. And these are the sorts of stories that people have told me over the years who report close encounter experiences, that, in the family line, they have these abduction experiences that get passed on from generation to generation.
Right.
Some of them are, they're quite traumatizing. Others, they're not. These are beings that are like people's families. So their second family, or maybe their first family, they feel that their human family is their second family. They're actually out there in the stars.
Right.
Yeah, so there's so many cultural stories about these types of beings. I think in Ireland they have the brownies who do play a similar role. I've got a book on the different beings that play these roles in different cultures, and it's amazing how similar they are and how they play out in the lives of people who report close encounters.
Absolutely. Paul, in fact, was in my second interview with him in his second book, The Scars of Eden. He talks about one African tribe, and they have mummy waters. I think they call it mummy waters. Forgive me if I've got the name wrong. These beings who live in or near the water, who abduct females, breed with them, and then return them unharmed after they've had a number of children. And in fact, he shared an experience from his family of a young woman who was abducted, missing for 3 years, and then returned unharmed. And during that period of time, she said she was held captive and bred with.
Wow. For a person in his own family.
Yeah.
Living today?
A distant family, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. There are stories of people who go missing for decades and return, and they haven't aged.
Yeah, Rip Van Winkle is one that comes to mind.
Yeah.
That old legend, yes.
Yeah. But even if the Indian mystic Sadhguru, he sat down, and I think he didn't. He just went into an altered state of consciousness spontaneously for, I can't remember, 10 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I can't even remember now, sorry. Now he's traveling the world talking about, on a motorbike, mind you, talking about, mysticism, his understanding of mysticism and transcendental experiences and how to deal with the world. And, it was like he went through some sort of shamanic initiation, what shamans would call an initiation experience.
Right.
And this is what I think happens to people who have close encounters. Life is going along a certain trajectory. They have these experiences, and some of them start in childhood, of course, and then they're changed by them. They're changed in many ways. They become spiritually engaged, less interested in worldly experiences, care less about what other people think of them. Basically, they become less materialistic, and they want to be more of who they really are. They want to align what exists within themselves in their outer world. So I see a lot of them. I've followed them over the years, and I've stayed in touch with a few who develop an interest in healing. And so they go on and become healers. For example, I have one of those people I met many years ago. We've stayed in touch and become friends, and he was a nurse at the time when he was having his experiences, and now he's a massage therapist. So there's this switch to more natural ways of healing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although, having said that, there was a young woman who became, after her experiences, she studied psychology and became a psychologist because she wanted to help people who'd had these experiences through mainstream medical systems. So, yeah, but it's less of those. It's more they go into the alternative health fields.
I have a friend who did that same thing, and she's a practicing psychologist. And she kind of patterns herself after Spock. That questioning type, but she's been an experiencer too her entire life.
Yes. And if they don't go down the healing path, they go down the creative path. So they become artists. They're musicians, performers, singers, actors. They'll do sculpting. They'll become, they'll paint. They'll do all sorts of things. There was one gentleman who was making samurai swords and selling them. Another one was doing welding forms and selling those. And they changed from completely left brain jobs to right brain work.
Yeah.
Right. And that's really interesting to me. And I wonder, I think that they probably had that right brain latency, but their experiences switched their hemispheric focus in their brain to that more creative side, and it switched it on. It triggered it.
Could have possibly. That's actually a good point. But also the right brain side, that intuitive creative side, is more closely attached to your heart and your feelings.
Yes, and actually it could be one of the reasons why that particular family line is selected, because I find, and you've probably found this too, that people who report close encounters often say, oh, I see dead people. I've had spontaneous mediumship things, and I don't know what that is, where it is coming from. Or they'll start doing glossolalia where they're speaking in tongues, or they'll suddenly become psychic, in a way that or if they already had those abilities, they're enhanced 10 times over.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so, and that's become quite common. And in the UFO research field, we've really only come to understand that in the last 15 years, to acknowledge that. Before that, it wasn't really being acknowledged much. It was by a handful of people, but not many.
Right. I can speak from my personal experience. My very first recollection of an experience was when I was 3 years old. That was my first conscious memory, although I had an experience earlier, but I don't recall seeing beings in that time. But I was actually speaking with the niece of Betty and Barney Hill a while ago, and she's a great researcher now. And she said to me, which I didn't know, she said many of the thousands of experiences that she's talked to had their first experience when they were 3 years old.
Yes, yep.
And I didn't know that. So that was a real revelation for me, and a validation as well, that it was, I'm getting goosebumps now, that it was actually correct.
Yeah.
And I recall, and because I am psychic medium, I recall being in, like Susie, being in learning environments, like in a classroom. That's the only thing I can liken it to my entire life. And I remember them teaching me specific things, like how to move things with my mind, the importance of sound and vibration, the importance of intent. And I know that what they taught me has made a huge difference to my ability to pick up on things.
Yeah, it's very common.
Very common.
Many years ago, I was doing a weekly radio show, which I stopped, but then one of our team took over. And he did continue to do that for 17 years. It was called the Paranormal Panel on commercial radio here on Radio 4BC. And I was telling him what I was finding in my research with interviewing people, talking to them about this and saying that, become highly creative. And it's beyond statistics, right? This was so predictable. 95% of people who were reporting close encounters, and this would have been going back in the late 90s, because I'd had enough time to, over a decade or more, to be able to gather that information. And I was saying to him that this is highly predictable.
Right.
Well, he tested it out on radio. So every person who would come on radio, because it was a talkback show, the host would ask, so what do you do in your spare time? And it would always come up. Oh, I write poetry, I paint, I sing, I perform, I'm a dancer, I'm this and that. And they were blown away over about a year of asking these people. They were just blown away how predictable it was, going from raised eyebrows, oh, really, to, then going, and then themselves going, we expect this, to report it. So it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. I think we should be doing some more research into that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I never thought about that. But all my life I've done fine arts and performing arts. I sculpt, I paint. I used to do silversmithing, voiceover, and now I do the podcast. So yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
And I actually, until you mentioned that, I hadn't actually given that a lot of thought.
Someone who picked it up very early on was John Spencer from Bufora, the British UFO organisation, which I think they closed their doors a few years ago. And he wrote a book called Gifts of the Gods. And in there he spoke, now that's going back, oh gosh, I can't even remember the date of it, but it's going back quite a while. And he was the first person, I think, who published about that phenomenon. Yeah.
Right. Yes, and isn't it interesting how, since the governments have been drip feeding people the past 2 or 3 or 4 years, And the media's now changed their way that they're reporting UFO encounters, especially since the US military came out and said, yes, these things are real. We don't know what they are. Although that report was a bit of a whitewash, but we knew it was going to be. That wasn't anything unexpected. But the fact that the pilots, more pilots, not just military pilots. In fact, I saw a report just the other day of a couple of pilots, and I can't remember where it was, reported seeing a UFO during their routine flight. Well, it's only recently, only in the past maybe month.
Yes.
And I find it's quite interesting how, of course, public's been manipulated so that the opinion is slowly changing. But it's really great that people are now more open and at least willing to entertain the prospect of life outside of this reality as we know it.
Yes. I think that DNI report was underestimated by a lot of UFO interested people because even though it was only, what was it, 9 pages or something, and it would have been nice to have all the classified material being released to the public.
Yes.
But one of the things that I like to point out to people was, remember, in there was a statement that said 143 pilots out of 144 could not identify UFOs. Yes. Never underestimate that. And I think that report, when it came out, it wasn't so much about, I mean, there were a couple of little gems in there that you could easily skip over, but it was designed to do something, not be something. I think it was designed to offer leverage for down the track, really. Yeah. So, yeah, very interesting.
Right. Yeah, interesting times, isn't it? Interesting times. I mean, I know certainly over my lifetime and seen a vast difference in people's acceptance.
And even some scientists, what about Michio Kaku?
Yes.
He started to flip around and he said, it's no longer the public's, no longer researchers' responsibility to prove that UFOs exist. It's now the responsibility for the government to prove that they don't.
Yeah, that is really great. Yeah, that was quite an interesting chat to talk to. So, Sheryl, what got you into the UFO side of it? Are you an experiencer yourself?
I have. I've had about 7 UFO sightings, which are quite credible, but I've also had a close encounter. I've only ever had one close encounter, which is very strange. I mean, not very strange, but it's, nothing like some people who have it their whole life at all.
Right.
My experience happened in around 1990, 91, and I was in bed with my ex-husband and we were asleep, and I woke up. And I don't know why I woke up. It was in the early hours of the morning. And I woke up to see these 3 small rays standing beside the bed. Now, here's a question for you. Why are there always 3?
I was just going to say that they always come in 3, don't they? I've never seen them in less than 3.
I don't know what that's about. That's another predictable part of close encounter reports. But anyway, so like I said, it was in the early hours of the morning. It was still dark, and they were standing there, and they were just looking at me, not moving, just staring. The outside street light was shining in the bedroom window, and I was on the window side, and so I could see the silhouettes of them standing there, except I do have a memory of their eyes. I'm not really sure how I could see that because they were shadowy. But anyway, I do have a memory.
Right.
And I was frightened. I have to tell you, I was terrified because I was wide awake. Mm-hmm. So when I talked, before that, I had started, that was 99, I got involved in 88, and I just jumped in boots and all, and I was talking to people who'd had close encounters. Abductions were really high in those days. And so for about 3 years, I'd been talking to people who talked about how terrified they were. Well, I got a real taste of it that night, but I did a very strange thing. I, pulled the sheet up over my head and I started spontaneously saying the Lord's Prayer. And I've heard of a few people since then who did something similar. But I didn't, it was not conscious. It was just an automatic response. And like I've said to a few people, I didn't even know I still knew it because I learned it in Sunday school and forgotten it,
Right.
And then the next morning I woke up, I had no memory until about lunchtime or just after lunch, and something triggered the memory of the night before. And I went, whoa. that happened last night, right? So there's a few questions around the whole experience. I mean, who goes to sleep terrified with your heart beating out of your chest?
Mm.
And it was instantaneous. You know, as soon as I pulled that sheet up, that was it. My last memory. It was next thing was morning. So yeah, there's a gap there, and I sort of left it aside because in '98, I think Bud Hopkins was here in Australia, and I flew down to Sydney to a conference where he was speaking with Leslie. Leslie Keane was with him at the time. You know, he stood up on the stage and he was saying exactly these things that I was saying to you, that, you know, there's the people go down the healing path or the creative aspect, right? And I'm going, wow, tick, 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 ticking all my boxes of things that I had discovered. But he did say, you know what, because hypnotherapy was a way of dealing with memory recall at those times. A lot of people were having it, and I happen to be a clinical hypnotherapist myself. But he did say, you know, if your life is going smoothly and getting on with things, you're coping with your experiences, he suggested that people don't dig around in their unconscious because they may not like more of what kind. Right. So he said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I sort of felt that was really, really grounded advice because I do know some people who had hypnotherapy and for memory recall. And one, you know, you can't guarantee that the memory recall is accurate because that's not how the unconscious mind works. It's you know, once you go into that altered state of consciousness, your creative aspect just completely unfurls.
Right.
So, and the mind the unconscious doesn't like gaps, so it tends to fill in pieces between clusters of memory. And so I've never dug around in my own mind to find out, you know, what happened because, you know, I know that these things happen. I know that people have experiences, and I just don't feel the need.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people have said, "Why don't you?" And I said, "I don't feel the need."
Yeah, yeah. I'm always of the attitude that if you're meant to know, then that memory will return. Like an example that I had was when I was young, maybe 5, 4, 5, 6, somewhere between those ages. We had an experience where a UFO came down over our house in the middle of the day. It was morning. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. The workers in the factory across the road from where I lived were all outside having their coffee. So they saw it and made this huge whirring noise, which brought my mum outside. And then it took off. And then we had a Men in Black visit the next morning from the Men in Black. And that was all I recall at that stage. And then it was probably in my 30s. I can't remember what triggered the memory, but I remember this blue beam coming out of the UFO, taking me up, and I had a face-to-face encounter with these beings. And they said to me, you won't remember this now, but when you need this memory, it will return to you. And it did. And I believe that it's the same for any experience, that if you're meant to have that memory, if it's important to you for whatever reason, then it will be there for you when you need it.
And I think that the timing of the memory returning is significant too.
Yes, absolutely.
And it reminds me of the Tibetan Terma tradition. And the Tibetan Termas, and that's spelled Terma, if anyone who wants to look it up, is that there are two types of termas. One is physical. So you might have a master who creates a physical object, an artifact, and then buries it for it to be, and it may have inscriptions on it. And it is not for the time that they're in, it's time for the time when it's dug up.
Right.
To have meaning and purpose for when the time that it's dug up. But it can also happen in your consciousness. So they can implant information into their initiate's mind that can stay there, you know, be latent in their mind, not only to be awakened later on in this life, but sometimes in future lives too. Yep. So the information becomes available to that person at a time when they can make the most use of it, and it will be significant in their existence. And it's a bit like shamanic experiences. The shamans talk about that the shamans are born with the seeds of that within them. And at a certain time, it is activated within them to be called forth for their vocation, and it is at the right time for that individual, and something will happen. And close encounter experiences, I do liken them to shamanic initiation experiences, because it is an awakening for people. And the more that they go down that path, the more they are living their vocation. They're doing their dharma. You know, they're doing what they came here to do, like you're doing this now.
Absolutely.
You know, it's part of you. It's your essence playing out in the world. You know, and you're doing many things, but this is how it's presenting itself onto the world stage, basically. And this is what happens with people who report close encounters. They have this, that, you know, I remember I spoke to a lot of abductees in the 90s. I mean, I had no life then. I often say that because I just spent the 1990s on the phone. There weren't too many people around in those days. There's less UFO groups around now, but there are more Facebook pages where people can have chats with people about and process their experiences. But in those days, there wasn't. You know, people would ring up and they'd often be traumatized by their experiences because they had our culture doesn't support those types of experiences. No cultural context for them whatsoever. No acceptance of them whatsoever in those days, except just in the UFO community, although there were a lot of documentaries that were being made at that time. So they were struggling. And what they would struggle with was the loss of who they were, their identity, right? Before their experiences. They wanted to go back. And I say, sorry, it's not going to happen. This has happened. You have to integrate it. And I'd say, these experiences change people, but the clue to surviving them, if you want to put it that way, or to integrating them, is to let them change you, to be more of who you are, to potentiate you in the world, so that you then go on and be and live and walk the life that these experiences have created for you.
Absolutely. Oh, I 100% agree with that. You can never go back. Well, for me personally, I mean, it's been my life, my entire life. It's as much part of my life as breathing is. It alters you. And I know that I'm doing part of the work that I agreed to do in speaking. I've never been shy about speaking about my UFO experiences, even as a child, to my detriment, because people weren't ready to hear back then, but it didn't stop me from speaking. And I know this is partly because of the training I received and because it's part of who I am. It's part of my soul essence, and it does alter your life. And for people who, up until the point that they have their experience, are just going about their normal day-to-day reality, perhaps not even questioning other paradigms, other ways of being or knowing of other existences other than this one, it's life-shattering and it's life-reaffirming in a lot of ways. So it can, for people, it can be incredibly traumatic, and that's one of the reasons I started my Facebook group. I have a Facebook group it's not a large group, it has over 6,000 members, but I started it so it would be a place for people who could talk about not only UFOs but other paranormal experiences they had, in a safe place, a safe environment where they wouldn't be judged, where they could speak freely without fear of being ridiculed, because that's so important because they are shattered. They don't know, their view of reality is completely gone, and they have to readjust their whole paradigm of being, pretty much.
Yeah. And then they have a role to play.
Yes.
So, and that's the next step.
Yes.
They adjust, they work on themselves. In a shamanic initiation, you're dragged off by the spirits, right? In a classic initiation experience, you're dragged off by these spirits. You are dismembered, dismantled, and then you have all these experiences in that state, and then you are put back together. But you are put back together because when you're dismantled, you become the hollow bone. What the shamans call the hollow bone. There's nothing left.
Right.
And I teach shamanic practices. And I've been through some really interesting and very difficult dismemberment journeys. I am bashed into the ground, dragged over waterfalls, drowned, strips of flesh, pulled off and on. But what happens is you then rebuild yourself, and you rebuild yourself from the inside out. Whereas before, many of us, our identity is formed from the outside in,
Right.
based on other people's expectations, social expectations, cultural expectations,
Correct.
So we become more authentic. We live a more authentic life. And that's the first step. The next step is then finding a place for your authenticity in the world.
Right.
Because we can't be like a monk living on a mountain in Tibet. We live in the Western world, right?
Right.
And we then have to find a way that we can take what we've become and put it into the world.
Mm.
And that's where a lot of people go from the the left brain jobs, some of them corporate, over to the healing fields or the creative fields, because it's a way those things are accepted in our society, and that's where they can find a place to belong. And the value of belonging in a society can never be underestimated.
Absolutely. And once they manage to do that integration and move on, then they make huge differences to people around them, to their community, to raising the energetic level of everybody around them. And they don't even have to say anything. It doesn't have to be it's just the energies are at that level that it automatically goes out to those around them and has that effect on them.
Well, we can identify some celebrities who've had close encounters or UFO sightings. And then, they've come out and they've spoken about that. I mean, we had, was it John Lennon who wrote the book about the Eggman? Yeah. Which was about an alien, about seeing UFOs, But, there are other celebrities who, sometimes this was why I really got interested in one aspect of close encounter experiences was, being on the end of a telephone line in the years gone by and waiting for people to report to us. I was thinking, how can I find them?
Right.
Knowing what I knew then about the types, the demographics of these people, where would I find them? Well, guess what? I'd probably see them on the big screen. I'd see them on stages singing to people. I would see them in the performing arts, I would see some artists. And here in Australia, Pro Hart, who's passed away, he was a well-known Australian artist. Well, guess what? He did this painting of an Australian outback scene with a UFO in it.
Oh, wow.
So you can predict who's probably had some sort of close encounter or at least had some UFO sightings. One of them I think I could predict would be Jackie Chan. He actually sings, he directs, he produces, he acts. He's a highly creative person. He's in the martial arts. He's got to have seen UFOs or had some sort of close encounter, but you'd never know it. He wouldn't talk about it. People in those situations. So I think for listeners, if you think about the types of people that even in your own countries who we have celebrities like here in Australia, Olivia Newton-John had UFO sightings. What's his name? I can't think of his name at the moment, but other Australian personalities, and there would be some in New Zealand who've, because of their creative background, you can bet they've had some type of event.
Yeah, absolutely. Or at the very least, some type of spiritual event. That's opened the door for them. That's so interesting. Of all the people you've interviewed in your role in the UFO field, what is the biggest thing that you've come away with?
Yes, that question. I think it would have to be, when I got involved, I was asking the questions, who are they, where are they from, and why are they here? But it very quickly went to, who am I, where am I from, and why am I here?
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So I think for me, the UFO subject, which I've inhabited, that's the only word I can describe it, is inhabited for decades, is the greatest tool for personal and spiritual development that I have ever explored. And for me, it's bigger, larger than the afterlife. It's
right
because it encompasses that. It encompasses shamanism. It encompasses healing. It encompasses science. It encompasses data. It's everything. That everything is in the subject. So I think anyone looking for something to explore, you can't go wrong with this subject.
Yeah, it opens so many doors. It creates questions, And
Yeah.
that leads to more questions, and that leads to more knowing. It's a very, very interesting topic. One of my favourite star person, he said to me once, and it's words that I've tried to live by ever since he said it to me. It made such an impact on me. He said to me, Marianne, whenever you do anything, you must do it from your heart. When you think from your heart. When you speak from your heart. When you act from your heart. And those were really, really wise. Of course, it's not easy to do because, you're human and people can, get under your skin and you can get annoyed and angry, but what he's talking about is a total way of living and a total way of being, and it's a spiritual thing as much as a physical thing, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And it'll take you on a path that you would not even know if you let it. You would never have known that path existed unless you let the subject take you along it. And it's taken me down some really interesting paths. At one stage, I bought a property and opened a New Age centre where we ran, yoga classes, Tai Chi classes, workshops on numerology. We used to have healing days and psychic fairs. And this is like going back I bought that property in 95. There were things I was doing there that weren't being done in Brisbane, but I've often wondered, how did my experiences, they did propel me. They played a part in going down that path.
Absolutely.
Very, very much so, yeah.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that because it was my experiences that led me into the nursing path to begin with, because I wanted to make a difference, a positive difference in people's lives.
Yes, yeah. And it's not always easy trying to navigate these paths because, at one stage, I sort of came to a point in my life and I wondered, this is about 10 years ago, and I asked myself, why am I so interested in the UFO subject? What draws me to it? And why am I just as interested in the afterlife and near-death experiences and all that? And I was taken down a path, and this is why it's important to put those questions out there. I was taken down a path that led me to shamanism. And that was where I did some incredible journeys, and one of them, the shamanic journey, and one of them was where I was shown, because everything's symbolic in a journey, and I was shown a desert area in Australia with just some like mud hills in the background, but there was a group of Aboriginal people around a fire having a corroboree. There was one Aboriginal elder off to the side, and he was standing there with a walking stick, just looking at me, and it's all done in silence, and he opens one arm and he sort of unfolds it in front of him as if like a hug. And then he points up, and I look up above the fire where the corroboree is, and here's a spaceship. And the message was, it's always been like this. It's always been like this. So what I got out of that was that Indigenous people have for a long time understood that, first of all, that these interactions have been going on a long time.
Yes, absolutely.
We do know in history that certain practices were the locations for them were set where ley lines cross. So there are locations are particular for these types of things to happen. So there are ceremonies and certain locations where these ceremonies are held. And at that time, it possibly opens up a portal through consciousness for these interactions to take place. And I think that we've seen that over and over and over again. And I have a friend who was a long-time crop circle researcher when she lived in the UK for 27 years. She's now moved back to Australia. And she was very interested in dowsing, and she was doing dowsing. I think it was Richard Hall, who's also passed away now. He was well known in the UK for dowsing. He taught her basically everything he knew, and they would dowse for the ley lines that would go through their sacred sites, but also through the crop circles, and where they would be found where crop circles crossed. And they could also dowse and find what she called whirlies, where the energy would be in a spiral pattern, right, and it would be going up into the air like a gusher,
right,
like energy would be coming out. And she said these ley lines, like they would fly over the crop circles at various times, and they could dowse in the air as they were going over the crop circles, and the the rods would open or crisscross, depending on whether they were over a crop circle or not. So these energy fountains go way up into the atmosphere. And who knows, perhaps they create a grid in the atmosphere, and perhaps this is a grid that the some UFOs follows, So it's all there. We just have to put the pieces together.
That reminds me of that book by Bruce Cathey and the Harmonic Grid. Do you remember?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, he was way ahead of his time. For listeners, Bruce Cathey was a New Zealand pilot who did a lot of research in sort of, well, I don't really know how to explain it, in the harmonic grids around the planet. And he came to all this through mathematics, I believe.
Yeah.
So he didn't approach it from a spiritual angle, it was purely from a scientific angle. But it's a very interesting book. I believe it's called Harmonic Grid.
Harmonic 33, I think.
Harmonic 33, that's it. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And it came out in the 70s maybe, or a bit later, I'm not sure. But it was kind of underestimated at the time, and then it came back into popularity again when more information about UFOs and stuff like that came out from other sources, and then his work was looked at again. But I think he was pretty onto it.
I think he's passed away now.
Yes, he has. Yes, he died some time ago. Yeah.
Oh, right, yeah. Because we were trying to get him out to Australia to speak at one of our conferences, but he wasn't well, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, he very, very interesting chap. So where do you see yourself going now?
Well, probably on the same path, but I'm sure there'll be different curves in the road because, UFO reports, there's less of them now that we get here at UFO Research Queensland. But I think, I don't know, I think that we're sort of at a crossroads on the UFO subject. We're sort of at a crossroads where we've gathered all this information. I mean, how long do we keep gathering data?
Yeah.
How long do we keep gathering it? But I think what's happened since 2017 when Ralph Blumenthal and Leslie King, had that article published in the New York Times and Washington Post and everything that's happened since then with the footage that has come out and now the ATIP report, saying that they're not ours. And the Chinese are saying they're not ours or they're not Russian, whose are they? Well, and then we've got these US Navy pilots who are saying we're seeing UFOs on a daily basis. I mean, things have hotted up. Like, I never would have predicted that would have become more mainstream as it has. It was just, even 5 years ago, I couldn't have predicted that. Now I think it's more about where the data takes us, what we do with that, what we can do with it, how we can use that to leverage, governments to come out and talk about this, although that's probably not going to happen until it's actually an issue on some ballot paper somewhere, I think the ball is in play and we just have to wait and see what happens.
Back in the 80s, one of my star people said to me, he said, Marianne, I said, what about the release of the information that the governments hold about you guys? And he said to me back in the 80s, he said, Marianne, we've given governments an ultimatum, I'm just paraphrasing here, that they have to release the information of this to humanity as a whole so people can make their own minds up. They can find their own spiritual path. If they do not release it, we have told them we will take that matter out of their hands and we will step in.
I don't know how that would play out, because I imagine that, and let's face it, I'm a Trekkie.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, me too. I think most experiences are to one degree or another, to be honest.
So I'm going to draw a little bit on Star Trek from my understanding, but having said that, some of it, a lot of it, I believe Gene Roddenberry was seeing a medium at the time, Phyllis Schlemmer, and that's where he got a lot of his ideas for the show from. Who knows where she was getting the information from in the ethers.
I asked my star people, I said, with programs like Star Trek and these other science fiction shows that are out, how much information have you guys actually given to people in terms of planting seeds in their minds. And he said, we've given a lot of information.
Yeah, I think so. They were spot on in a lot of ways. They covered the abduction experiences.
Yeah.
Oh, that's what I was going to talk about, first contact. I don't know what
Right.
extraterrestrials would do to take it out of the hand of Earth governments to make themselves known. I think they would have had a lot of experience with those contact events in the past, and they probably have formed their own policies and procedures, practices in how to deal with that. What they are, I haven't got a clue. I doubt it would be them showing up in loads in our skies. I think that would just be too much for humanity. And I don't think that they're about that, about creating harm.
No, they're not.
In human affairs. So I think that they'd be very careful about how they did it, but they may, and I do believe that, like you say, that they're passing on information to people in ways that are, they're not giving them a document. That way, they're giving them ideas. They're prompting people and to go down certain paths.
I interviewed a chap last season, and the episode was called "The Incident at Eloise Creek," the Eloise Creek incident. Now, this guy was a kid, 4 years old, when a UFO crashed in the swamps behind where his mum lived, and his aunt lived in a house next door, way out in the wops. And this UFO crashed. It was near a nuclear plant, actually. And they saw it crash. It was actually shot down. They saw this beam of light come down, hit the UFO, and it imploded. He said it imploded. And he talks about how the government, the military, was there within 20 minutes at their farm. They had the site cleaned out in the dark within 2 hours. And they threatened his mum, who was a single mother, and they said to her, if you tell anyone about this, we'll take your son away from you. And so for years she was forced to keep, but his mum died about a year ago. So now he's speaking out because there's no threat that they can place over her. So he's speaking out about it. And we talked about this, about what you and I have just talked about. And he said, we are the disclosure. Us experiences are the disclosure. And more of us are going to speak out about it. And I guess, in a way, that's what I'm doing with my podcast. That's what you're doing with your work. So really, I kind of tend to feel that it will come through more and more people speaking out, more and more people accepting, and I think it's going to come that way rather than from governments, because governments will never tell you the truth.
No, they're going to want to control that narrative.
Absolutely.
And I think that there's a real move on at the moment for them to sort of whitewash anything that happened before the Nimitz encounter.
Oh, absolutely.
And, with the Tic Tac, and they're going to try and establish that this is happening now. They'll never be able to lie about what's happened in the past. But that is why it is so important that people like yourself have podcasts and have platforms for people to speak about this, because that can gain momentum. That, like you say, that disclosure, that grassroots disclosure is the way to go. And people always forget that people power is far stronger than governmental power or even media power.
Oh, absolutely.
People power will always win. Sometimes it just takes a while to catch on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this was back in the 80s they told me this, and since then I've seen a steady increase in people coming forward, people not being so shy about speaking out despite the ridicule. And now, I can talk to people now and they don't laugh to my face anymore like they would previously, because people are more accepting. And certainly with everything that's happening around the world, it's making people pause and think and consider other alternatives.
Yes, exactly. And I think when you have people like Michio Kaku speaking out, now we've got Avi Loeb, who says that he's looking the Galileo project is looking for extraterrestrial artifacts in the solar system and beyond. And now there are UFO researchers who are getting on board with the Galileo project. We've got Lou Elizondo who's joined them, Chris Mallon, ex-intelligence who've joined them. There's a lot happening.
There is a lot happening. Now, Professor Avi Loeb, he's the only one I've ever been nervous about speaking to because he's, such a scientific brain. And I thought, when I heard about him, I thought, oh, I'd really love to speak to this chap. He's so cool. So how can I get in touch with him? So I just looked up his Harvard University address and emailed him. And he came on my show. He was lovely. Lovely chap. So easy to talk to, so brave considering his standing in the community and all the scientific accolades that this man has to come out and say Oumuamua was an extraterrestrial object, not a naturally occurring object. Yep. And the scientific explanations as to why.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting artifact. And I'm glad to see that the Galileo project is steaming ahead.
Yes.
And the people who are getting on board with that, and UFO researchers too, they've joined. Wow, this is the first, scientists and UFO researchers working together.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, isn't it? It's exciting times we live in. I say that quite often. I'm getting goosebumps. It's exciting times we live in. I believe that despite all the fear porn that's been put out into the world at the moment about numerous different things, it's exciting times because we as a humanity are moving forward as a whole.
Yeah. It's interesting how people are facing fears at the moment, having to face fears at the moment, put it that way. And yet we have these things in the background, these big movements in the background happening. And, for these changes over the last 3 years in the UFO field, that's phenomenal. People should never underestimate that. That is phenomenal. And I think that, I know that there are behind the scenes too, there are astronomers who are taking an interest in this too, and there's moves in that field behind Avi Loeb where they're going, what's this UFO? What are these UFOs like? What's that all about? What's happening? They want to know before they just whitewash it and say we don't want to know about that. Talk to the hand, basically. Don't tell us about that. You're all idiots. Not anymore. And for a long time, I've said to people, well, if you think that I'm a bit of a fool for taking on board the UFO subject and accepting it as real, then I'm glad because I'm, sharing that space with astronauts, right? Intelligent people who've been out in space, some of them who've said that they've seen things that, that there were things following them on their missions.
Yes.
So I don't care what you think because actually, I don't think you've done your homework, basically.
Interesting that you say 3 years ago. I'm going to go back to that. Back in the 80s again, I said, what's going to happen? And we talked about the Earth and Earth changes, that a lot of experiences talk about the need for looking after the Earth and protecting her and environmental tragedies that could occur. And he said to me, Marianne, he said, what's happening is currently the Earth's been held in position like a baby, and he did this like you're rocking a baby with your hands. And he said, we're waiting till a certain percentage of humanity has reached a level of spiritual awakening. Then the energies will change and things will move forward very fast. Well, 3 years ago, that point was reached. And I felt the change. I literally felt the change in energy that a certain percentage of humanity was, when I say awake, they were questioning status quo, they were finding their spiritual path, they were questioning the beliefs and the teachings that they had been taught for eons. They were questioning, why do things have to be like this? Why? And I felt the energy shift. I literally felt it in my body. And as soon as I felt it, I made a post in my group saying, this has just happened. Now, from this, watch what this is going to happen and this is going to happen and this is going to happen. And you're going to see more people standing up and speaking out. And then the Me Too movement started, and then all other movements started. And since then, there's been a massive change in humanity.
Yes, there has. And, I guess this is the only upside of the pandemic, is that people had to stop and face themselves, reevaluate their lives, reevaluate what they think they know. And it's like we had a planetary near-death experience.
Yeah.
And, everything that you and I have been talking about, how people are changed by their experiences.
Absolutely.
It happened to humanity on a global level.
Yeah.
And since then, how many podcasters have come out? Like, wow, hundreds. And that's another creative expression of that experience, talking about UFOs, talking about the environment, talking about spiritual education, the afterlife, everything. It's like there's an explosion of people wanting to share and communicate. I mean, that's just one thing that I've seen, right? And there's a lot of other things happening that aren't so much in your face, but wow. So it's a bit like, we're in the Renaissance.
Yeah.
We're looking at different ways to do things in a more progressive, useful, harmonious, creative way.
And people are looking more at looking after the planet and recognizing that she's a living entity as well. And she has to go through her own growth and development.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And we're not separate from her. As she goes through her growing pains, we feel it. And she feels what we go through as well. It's a symbiotic relationship.
No, it's a very, very complex experience that we've all gone through. And, I'm just relating this as a planetary near-death experience for people, individuals who have these types of experience, what they go through. What the planet's gone through is what individuals go through, where they go, okay, who am I now? What's really important to me? What do I want to do with my life now? We're seeing this great shift culturally, socially, economically, governmentally. Here you might have been hearing about the Great Resignation that's supposed to come to Australia in March 2022, and it started in China, where young people are saying, hey, guess what? I don't want to go into debt for the rest of my life and work to pay off a mortgage or to do things. I want to have a simpler life. I want to have a life. Choosing to have less material goods in their life. That was the first article I saw come out a few months ago about that. But the state in China, they didn't like that. They want you to be part of the system, but but the young people were saying, no, thank you. Another article I saw about a month ago from another country, and then there was one written not too long ago about, the Great Resignation is going to hit Australia in March 2022, and the tables are going to be turned, and employers are going to have to market their jobs. The tables will be turned, and we don't have to market ourselves to employers. The employers have to market the work because people are making different choices. They're deciding to do what they love, start a business doing what they love, and this is exactly what happens to people who have close encounters and near-death experiences and all sorts of experiences, where they reevaluate and choose a lifestyle, which is where their outer world is much more aligned with their inner world.
Yeah. Isn't it exciting?
It is.
It's very exciting.
Yeah, I'm interested to see where we're going to be in another 3 or 4 years.
Oh, yes. Like when COVID first started, I put out a mini podcast called The End Game. And in it, I talked a little bit about conspiracy, not much because this podcast isn't a conspiracy podcast, but I put out more about social manipulation and how the CIA termed the phrase conspiracy theory as a way of discrediting people who question the status quo, and how it was socially manipulated to be a bad thing when actually people are just questioning. And these days, here in New Zealand anyway, the difference between a thing being a conspiracy theory and a fact seems to be about 6 months in New Zealand at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's been like that here too in Australia.
Yeah.
I think actually Russell Brand said that.
Oh, did he?
Yes, the difference between a conspiracy theory and a fact is 6 months.
I like Russell Brand. He's really cool. I find him an incredibly wise person in a lot of ways, very deep. And his experiences certainly show. I know he's a figure that polarizes people for sure. For sure. My understanding is a little bit different to a lot of experiences on what's happening. And so what I said basically was to people, I said, don't buy into the fear that's been put out into the public. That's deliberately been manipulated because the fear's been used to control you. And try and see past your fear. If you're fearful about hearing about COVID or whatever situation, go outside, ground yourself, take your shoes off, walk in nature, hug a tree, go and find somebody in your neighbourhood who could use some help. That single mum down the road, is she okay? Is there anything you can do to help her? That old person who lives next to you, maybe they just need somebody to say hi. Look what you can, to see what you can do in your neighbourhood to help those who are struggling. And then that will help you get out of that fear state.
Yeah. Just touching on the point of fear and going back to the UFO subject, I think that, let me just preface this and let's say that I'm forever grateful for Stephen Greer with the Disclosure Project and bringing those witnesses forward, and the press conference that was held at the Washington Press Club.
That was great.
I think he did the UFO community a service there. And from then on, I've been able to talk about those when I speak at community groups and library groups and wherever. I can always quote that. And I will be forever grateful for him bringing those very credible witnesses forward. However, I do not agree with him that all extraterrestrials are benign.
Oh, no, absolutely. No. I'm sorry.
No, you're right.
I'm totally with you on that. In fact, that's what I was going to go into before, but I didn't. My knowing is that there's 3 groups. There's those that are benign and are benevolent towards humans, want to help humans develop their full potential and become a part of the greater intergalactic community. There are those who made an agreement with the US government who are not benevolent, who do not have humanity's best interests at heart, and in fact could care less about humanity. We're just cattle to them. They don't care about us at all. Then the 3rd group are neutrals. They just watch and observe. Don't participate either way. That's my knowing.
Yeah.
For what it's worth.
Yes. So I agree. I do think that there are observers that perhaps they're either observing from a distance or they're actually inhabitants here on Earth that have been here long before humanity, and they're always watching on what we're doing. And perhaps they're inner Earth dwellers. I don't know. That's just a guess. So they're residents, basically. Then I think that there are some that are a threat, that they see the resources on the planet. I'm not just talking about minerals or water, but the DNA.
Human energy as well.
Of all life forms. I've often thought, is there a cosmic black market out there that gathers DNA and then trades it on the, out there in the market? That's a possibility. And then there are those who probably sit on the fence and they're just opportunistic.
Yes, absolutely.
Yep. If it's opportune to support these humans, we will. Yep. Or if it's opportune to utilise some of the things that they have, then we will.
Yeah.
Of course, there are benefic types who are interested in humanity. They may just be a scientist. They may be researchers, like we would do on other planets, and they don't intend to harm us. They just happen to be here studying.
Yeah.
But, maybe accidents happen sometimes. I don't know.
Those ones that you mentioned as opportunistics, I include those in the malevolent group because they are by nature opportunistic. So I include those in with the malevolent. But yes, you're right. Pretty much there are 4 groups.
That's the other thing I was going to say. I've found that people who report close encounters, and I always say it like that, I don't say abductees or contactees, I just say people who report close encounters, because that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
That they're socially conscious.
Mm.
So they're probably the first to criticise their own government, their own society, the social strata, the things that are wrong on the planet. In 1991, I think it was, the report came out, the Roper report, and in there they found that experiencers were what they call the trendsetters rather than the trend followers. And they're often they get involved in committees. They're the letter writers. They're the people that ring up on talkback shows and say and give their opinion.
Yeah.
They're not so backward in being forward, or they grow into that person. They become quite outspoken.
Yeah.
And that's what we need. And maybe, it's like changing society from the inside out.
Mm. Bingo.
Yeah.
And that, sorry to interrupt, Sheryl, but that brings me onto the subject of starseeds.
Mm.
Now, I know for my person, I know that I came here deliberately to do a work. The group of beings that I work with, they have the prime directive. You cannot interfere, to use that Star Trek term, you cannot interfere with a developing society from the outside. But if you have people on the ground in those physical bodies, then you can affect change from the inside out.
Mm.
And that's what we do. And I know that I chose to come here to do this.
Yeah.
I've been consciously aware of that since I was a child.
Yeah.
And many who report encounters they may not remember that specifically, but they all know that they have a work to do, a very important work to do.
Yes. And they're peppered throughout society.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
That's how you change a civilization. It's from the inside out, through awareness, through their consciousness. Whether in different cultures, different countries, it doesn't matter. And I think that I've always found it really interesting that people who report close encounters change in a particular direction.
Mm.
So, for example, they might be like a delta of a river. There may be many tributaries coming together, but then they do.
Yes.
And then they form the river. So, experiencers change in that particular direction. And I've asked myself, why? Why did they change in another way?
Mm.
Why did they become, council workers and fix roads or that sort of thing? And maybe some do, but why aren't we seeing a big movement towards that? Like, why is there this demographic? And it has purpose.
Mm.
It has purpose to have a role in our civilization.
Absolutely. Sure. One thing I've noticed over the past 2 years in my group is that I'm getting a lot of young mums with children at around the age 2 saying, my baby's seeing spirits and they're having this and they're having that. So many started happening, like 30 or 40 within the space of a few weeks in my group. Mums coming on desperate for help. They came to my group because a mums group suggested that they come and talk to me. And these young children who are the latest generations of starseeds are being woken really early. When I say being woken, their spiritual abilities are being enhanced really early, whereas before they would have not started doing that until they were in their late teens or early 20s. But it's been consistent. And in fact, today I've just had 3 mums on my group with exactly the same thing happening to their little 2-year-olds. And it always starts between the ages of 2 and 3.
Yeah. That's something that I also noticed too with people who reported close encounters, that, again, like Kathleen Martin told you, the first time is around 3 years of age.
Mm.
The next time might be 7, but it's usually early teen years. And then it's later on in the late 20s or early 30s. And if they basically haven't got it by then I don't know what's happening. But what I mean is, then they sort of have a major wake-up experience, and then they can look back and go, okay, this has happened in my life around these ages. And I found that was just, again, predictable.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure why 3 years old. I could certainly understand 7 because we come to an age of reason, I think, at 7 years old where we have that fully self-awareness.
Yes.
And we've sort of formed, we've formed in our identity by age 7. And then in our early teen years, well, I think, what was her name? Betty Luca, I think, or out of the Andreasen affair, Betty Andreasen.
Right.
I remember her like that. She had an experience at that age, and she was told, she was visited, she had a visitation, and they said, oh, we're not coming for you yet, but we will come later. But they made themselves known to her. I think it was 18. You're not ready yet, but we'll be back, basically. But that's not uncommon. It's not common at all. And then they come back later, often when women can actually conceive or have conceived. So there's a few things going on there. There's by different groups.
Yeah, yes, because of course not everybody's experiences are the same. But I think for these little 2-year-olds, I think what is happening is they're turning their switches on, their psychic switches on to prepare them. I find it so interesting that it's been the past couple of years that this has happened. Like, I've had my group going for over 3 years now, and it's only and I can always tell when there's a shift in the general energy around the world because I get heaps of people joining at once, like 100 people, 200 people joining on one day, So it's very interesting that they are doing this now and that they're waking these youngsters, preparing these youngsters so early, whereas before they had more time. And that just that sets my intuition off, knowing that something major is going to happen very soon.
I wonder if it's something to do with what's been happening on Earth with this pandemic, because you mentioned the last 3 years. Yeah, I do wonder about that.
Yeah, I'm sure it's all connected, although my intuition about the pandemic is certainly it's very real, but it was deliberately released, and it was deliberately released as a means of control by the others who don't want to give up the control that they have over the planet at the moment. It's this battle that's still going on.
Well, I guess it depends what's happening with those young children when they're having, because we're all switched on at certain times when our evolution requires it. So perhaps they'll be switched on early because as they get a little bit older, into their teens and 20, and of course we'll have the corona teens.
Yes.
Maybe that particular awareness of those children may be very necessary.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking. That's my thought too, is they're turning them on so much younger because they need them to be ready at a specific stage. And whether that's in 5 years' time, 3 years' time, 2 years' time, who knows? 4-year-olds can say the most amazing, wise, wonderful things.
Yes, yeah. I also think that we should remember that we are connected to Earth, and Earth has our own consciousness.
Oh, absolutely.
And perhaps that the switching on, some of the switching on that we're seeing is actually because of what's happening to Earth. And, it's like sympathetic resonance.
It's all interconnected. It's all interconnected. You can't disconnect this from the star people, from the Earth. It's all interconnected, and it's all working towards the same goal ultimately.
Yes. And it's a bit like, there's a lot of talk about environmental concerns too, which a lot of people who've had encounters are also highly concerned about that.
Yeah.
Actually, I would say that is their number one worry.
Yes.
The environment. So it's like when there is a tree that is under stress, it will drop its seeds to make sure that the species continues.
Right.
And I think sometimes that might be what is going on as well. That
interesting.
Humans, that these children are being activated because they are the seeds for what Earth needs in the future to look after the environment.
Goosebumps. Whenever I get goosebumps, that's generally, for me, it's a sign I'm hearing a truth. A spiritual truth. I've really enjoyed this conversation with you, and I know that I could probably ask you heaps more. Where can people contact you? Are you on social media?
Absolutely. They can find me on my personal Facebook page. There's also the Strange Encounters Down Under Facebook page, UFO Research Queensland Facebook page. There's a few others, but I won't confuse people. And they can find me through UFO Research Queensland website as well. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah, shoot me a message, ask me questions. I love to talk to people about these subjects. If anyone wants to have me speak to a group, whatever, I'd be more than happy to do so.
Brilliant. That's awesome, Sheryl. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today. It's been really interesting talking to you.
Oh, thank you, Marianne. It's been a pleasure.
So, that was my lovely guest, Sheryl Gottschall, from across the ditch in Aussie. I hope you all have enjoyed our conversation, and perhaps it may have given you pause for thought. That's not a bad thing. Check out her pages, which are all linked on this episode's page of our website, www.walkingtheshadowlands.com. Next episode, I have a special guest who is involved in a famous, very, very famous military UFO incident in Bentwaters at the US military base in the UK while she was on active duty. Her story is very interesting. Be sure and subscribe to Walking the Shadowlands so you don't miss out. Today's bumper music was called Aliens. If you enjoy this podcast and have considered becoming a sponsor, now's a great time to join. Just head over to patreon.com/MCC15 and sign up now. As a patron, you get early access to the podcast episodes and a special members-only page on the podcast website that has bits that end up on the digital cutting board and little extras like full, raw, unedited video conversations with guests, EVPs caught during the conversations, and so much more. Also, you can download full written transcripts of each episode, and you get my absolute appreciation and gratitude. Patreon.com/MCC15 for just the cost of a cup of coffee a month. And so you don't miss out on an episode, make sure you subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform. This podcast is available on all free podcasting platforms, including iHeartRadio and Pandora as well. Also, if you have Alexa, simply say these 4 words, open Walking the Shadowlands, and Alexa will play our latest episode for you. Check out our Facebook page, Walking the Shadowlands, our Twitter feed, @Shadowlands10, TikTok under walking_the_Shadowlands. Like and follow for teasers of our upcoming episodes. If you don't have a smartphone, then you can listen to the episodes from the podcast website, www.walkingtheshadowlands.com. For those hearing impaired, there's a full written transcript of each episode on the website, so you don't miss out at all. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your workmates about our show. Encourage them to listen and to subscribe also. The more, the merrier. Thanks for listening to this episode. Ka kite ano, oia koe. I'll see you again.
Thanks for listening.